So we have covered a fair number of collectors so far, but I have to admit, unintentionally, but rather unfairly, the vast majority have been bryologists. So studying specialists who are studying mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. And there've been really very few that were particularly studying lichens. And I think that's mainly because here at Tennessee, we have a much larger bryophyte collection, and we digitize that first. So I've just come in contact with a lot more bryologist names than lichenologists. So I thought today I'd try to tell the story of someone in that field. And we don't actually have any of this collector's specimens here in our herbarium, but I did find some from our partners. This was collected by A.L. Smith in October of, 1907. It was collected in England at Almswick Park in Northumberland. And Northumberland is a county in the very northeast of England, so right along its border with Scotland. And Almswick Park, I believe, refers to the Alnwick Garden, which is the formal gardens and grounds next to Alnwick Castle. The garden itself was created by the first Duke of Northumberland in 1750 and expanded by the third Duke, who was a botanical enthusiast and planted seeds there from around the world. It was expanded by the third Duke, who, as the fourth Duke, transformed it into an Italian-style garden, which was more recently updated starting in the 1990s by the current Duchess of Northumberland. And her renovations added, among other things, a poison garden, which includes 100 toxic, intoxicating, and narcotic plants. It's kept behind iron gates and only accessible via guided tours. The website says, visitors are strictly prohibited from smelling, touching, or tasting any plants, although some people still occasionally faint from inhaling toxic fumes while walking in the garden. So a pretty unique attraction. Here's the modern map, and it is open to the public. So you can consider checking that out if you're ever in that region of England. The specimen in this case was not imaged, sadly, but it is identified as the fungus Acanthamyces johnsonii. Full disclosure, this is not a lichen. I had trouble finding examples with any pictures at all in the lichen portal. So this is technically from the myco portal. So it is still a fungus. And excuse me, here are some pictures of that species. It's a white cinematus fungi, which means it grows these sort of stalk-like structures described as looking like stalks of wheat. Interestingly, the rest of the species in this genus, Acanthamyces, are considered entomogenous, which means they are parasitic on insects, especially spiders, butterflies, and moths. But this particular species is the exception, is the only exception, not an exception yet anyways. It's saprophytic, which means it grows on and consumes decaying matter. And we can see here it was growing on dead wood, which was corrected to being a dead herbaceous stem on this later kind of typed label. So a final interesting note is that when this species was revised in 1988, one of the reference specimens listed in that article is this specimen from Almswick Park, collected by Smith. So kind of a cool connection. So A.L. Smith was Annie Lorrain Smith, British Lichenologist and Mycologist. She was born in Everton, Liverpool in England in 1854, but she grew up in Dumfriesshire, which is a historic county in southern Scotland. Her family is described as large and talented. 3 of her brothers became university professors, and 1 was a notable pathologist. Annie went to school in Edinburgh, but at that time, women weren't really able to go to university. For some context, in 1869, when Smith was 15, a group of women called the Edinburgh Seven were the first women to be allowed to enroll at the University of Edinburgh, and they were studying medicine and wanted to become doctors. But there was a lot of pushback from male professors, from students, especially when the women routinely did better than most of the men on exams. And so they suffered pretty severe harassment. There was even a riot at one point. And at the end, the university refused to award them their degrees, which it's a really crazy story actually, but inspired them and others in a continued fight for the right of women to access university education in the UK, which they were eventually successful in, but it took a long time and was really obviously not soon access to university education in the United Kingdom, but it was still a bit early. For women like Annie to be able to take advantage of that. So her parents did help her go abroad, and she studied French in France and German in Germany. And she worked for a time as a governess, but she ended up moving to London to study botany in 1878. So when she was in her mid-20s, Smith took classes at the Royal College of Science from D.H. Scott, who was a British botanist and paleobotanist. And the school was created to train teachers, and women were really only allowed to enroll as occasional students. But Scott was impressed enough by Smith that he helped her find work at the Natural History Museum of London. And she worked from 1895 to 1920 in its cryptogamic herbarium. So while she undertook some initial research on seaweeds, fungi became her main interest. Her first major project was curating a collection of fungi from this Heinrich Anton de Berry, who was a German surgeon, botanist, microbiologist, and mycologist, and considered one of the founding fathers of plant pathology and modern mycology. Smith worked to curate his collection of fungi on microscopic slides, including remounting most of them, and basically after the museum had purchased that collection. So Smith quickly became the main person to identify fungi that came into the collection. In 1895, she published her first new taxon describing the fungus Cycloderma apiculatum from specimens found in Kenya. And she would go on to report on many new fungi from both the UK and internationally, especially those from tropical East Africa, Angola, and the West Indies, even though she never traveled there. Because the museum was not officially allowed to employ women, she had to be paid from external funds and was classified as an unofficial worker, even when she became the acting assistant in the cryptogamic herbarium during World War I staffing shortages. She would continue to study fungi, especially lichens, for the rest of her career. In 1906, she completed the second volume of James Crombie's monograph of British lichens after his death. And she would go on to revise both volumes for their second editions in 1918 and 26. Starting in 1909, she acted as the lichenologist for natural history surveys on Clare Island in Ireland. The project included both Irish and European scientists, and was one of the first projects to really seek to completely characterize a particular biogeographical region. In 1921, she published a handbook of British lichens, which notably included identification keys for every, at that time, known lichen in the British Isles. That same year, Smith published a lichen textbook, which became the standard textbook for lichens for several decades. One source said it was in use for 50 plus years. She was active in a number of scientific organizations. She was a member of the Essex Field Club, which was founded in 1880 by a group that included Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. She herself was a founding member of the British Mycological Society in 1896. And I found this great picture of one of the group's fungus forays in 1905. And you can actually see Smith here in the group. And a lot of her personal field work was done on outings like this with the Essex Field Club and with the British Mycological Society. Smith served as the Society's president in 1907 and 1917 and attended meetings regularly for 35 years. In 1914, she traveled to Australia for the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science and also visited the United States. She was a president of the Southeast Union of Scientific Societies in 1922, so very busy. Smith was also a lifelong advocate for women's suffrage and women's rights. She never married, but lived with her older sister for 50 years. She retired in 1932 and passed away in 1937 at the age of 82. During her career, Smith wrote more than 80 scientific publications and described over 200 new fungi taxa. Smith was one of the first women elected as a fellow of the Linnean Society in 1904 when they changed their bylaws to allow women. And she served on its council from 1918 to 1921. In 1931, she was awarded a civil list pension in recognition of her services to biological science. And in 1934, she was appointed as an officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, which is also called an OBE, for her contributions to mycology and lichenology. And at least 3 species are listed as being named in her honor, including 2 lichens. Again, with a name like Smith, it's kind of hard to tell for sure. So there might be more. And so I had a trouble finding digitized specimens that she collected. Again, similar to Margaret Brown last week, there's a lot of Smiths to kind of weed through. Apparently, Smith is the number 1 most common name in the US, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So I did not expect anything in the bryophyte or the vascular symbiotoportals, since she was really focused on fungi, but I was surprised to find so few in the lichen and mycoportals. In the sources, it does say that her herbarium and types are housed at the Natural History Museum in London, and I did find about 40 in their database, including this one that had an image of a lichen that she collected. But again, not a ton. It also says that some for fungi are at Kew Gardens, and that I had trouble because I wasn't able to figure out. It doesn't look like you could search their database by collector, so I have to do a bit more digging. But so there's surely more than this, but not a lot digitized that I could find, sadly. And presumably also too, again, since she was the main person identifying fungi for the museum for a period of time, there's probably a lot more that she's the determiner on. So that is Annie Lorrain Smith, lichenologist and mycologist, who wrote some very foundational guides for the lichens of the British Isles and was a respected authority despite the challenges that she faced as a woman in science at that time. So thank you again for listening.